countries like India and China, they are big because they have big populations of about 1 billion or more than 1 billion each. But per capita, they're actually quite low in emissions. And that's why, of course, India and China say the industrial nations have to take the lead when it comes to reducing their carbon dioxide emissions. So, what do we need to do to stop the warming trend? We can still stop it, and the goal of the European Union and also the German government is and has been for a number of years to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade. That's the magic 2-degree limit that is much discussed, and it looks like more and more countries are also agreeing with this and adopting this, and hopefully now the United States as well, under the new president, will join in this effort to limit global warming to a maximum of 2 degrees. And that is above the pre-industrial value. So we've already had a warming of 0.8 degrees. That gives us another 1.2 degrees of warming before we can stop it. And there is very little chance to get much below those 2 degrees. You'd have to take really draconian measures to reach that. But with more realistic measures, you can actually just about keep the warming under those 2 degrees. What you need to do for that is you follow these green scenarios. This green band, these are emissions of global greenhouse gas emissions that give you about a 75% chance to stay below that 2-degree limit. So if you follow this green corridor here, you've basically have a very good chance to stay below the 2-degree warming limit. If we do nothing, emissions will continue to increase, and they have actually up till 2008 or so followed very much here along the upper path of those scenarios. So this is what we get when we do nothing, these red curves, and we need to kind of stop the trend of rising emissions, go to falling emissions, and reduce the emissions by at least 50% here by the middle of this century. That's the challenge, but many detailed studies have shown that it's possible to reduce the emissions that much without compromising our economic well-being. And what is needed for that is a major transition in our energy system towards much greater efficiency and towards renewable energies. And I just show you one picture, one possible scheme, how Europe could be supplied with 100% renewable electricity by creating this European supergrid where we network all the different countries so that we can feed in the renewable energy from the best sites all around Europe. For example, wind power from the North Sea area here, and solar power from Spain, but also from North Africa. This is the new thermal solar power station that has been opening in Spain this year. So based on such a scheme, you can also cope with the fluctuations that you always get in the renewable energy supply, wind fluctuations, and that's this problem gets greatly alleviated if you have a large supergrid, because the wind is always blowing somewhere, and you always have somewhere you have solar power, and you can. This has been worked out on an hour-by-hour basis with real observed wind data, etc. And with such a system, you need about 20% energy that you use for regulation, and you can do that with the hydro lakes in Europe and with some amount of biomass which you can store as a renewable energy source. But most of it, 80%, you can do directly from wind and sun. And by the way, the costs have also been worked out, because these kind of power stations, they exist. So you know what they cost to build, and the cost of this system would supply us electricity at about the same price as we have now. It's not more expensive than the fossil system that we have now. It's just a question of we are now locked into an old style infrastructure. How can we get the political transition to a different system against the resistance of those players that benefit from the current system that we have now? I mentioned that economically, there have been many economic studies that show that this is not a big deal. It's not as big a problem as the financial crisis that we have now. And yeah. Let me sum up, because we want to have some time for discussion. Main point is we are in the midst of global warming. The data show that. That's very clear. So far we have seen a warming of 0.8 degrees, and the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are the main cause of this. That's also very clear. And this warming has a series of impacts: extreme events, heat waves, droughts, flooding, storms, sea level rise. I mentioned those. And if we leave this going on unchecked, so far we've only had 0.8 degree warming, and we already see pretty substantial impacts. If we leave this unchecked and we end up with 3, 4, 5, 6, some scenarios, even 7 degrees global warming by the end of the century, then we will not recognize this planet, I can tell you, and it will not be a pleasant change that we find there. There is a risk of real surprises in the system because we cannot predict everything, obviously. We can do the global temperature pretty well, but all the impacts, methane release from permafrost or from the seafloor, etc., these are all incalculable risks that we run if we change the climate too much. But we can do something. We can't stop the warming right away, but we can, over the next 50 years, we can stop it if we gradually ramp down our emissions globally by at least 50% by mid-century. In this way we can limit the warming to 2 degrees, which will hopefully make the consequences still manageable, and so that we can adapt to those changes. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, we have immediately one question here.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Number 1, you talked about tropical cyclones. What about tornadoes? Do they increase in number and in strength? And the second question is, what part of the CO2 emissions do IT systems have?
Okay, I can't answer that second part. I don't know. You mentioned how much one Google query causes in emissions. There certainly is, I've heard that the internet already consumes like 10% of the global electricity or something. So there is a lot of scope there also in the IT sector to reduce the emissions by more intelligent technologies. Your first question, tornadoes, as far as I know, there's no evidence that tornadoes have increased in frequency or strength due to global warming.
Okay, in the beginning you showed us the chart with the temperature and the CO2 levels from the ice cores, and they showed that the temperature almost follows the CO2 increase. And then you showed the ice ages, which can be seen in this graph. But then you said that the temperature and the ice ages were explained astronomically by changes in the Earth circle around the Sun. So does the CO2 level also then follow from the Sun, or are there seem to be 2 explanations for the same phenomenon?
No, the CO2 indeed varies the variations look very similar to the temperature variations, but if you do a very detailed analysis, you find that CO2 is actually lagging slightly the temperature changes. So what's happening there is that first the orbital changes, they change the temperature, and those temperature changes with a certain time lag also cause changes in the CO2 concentration, which then, because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, amplify the initial temperature change. So it's an amplifying feedback in operation there. And by the way, this feedback explains why the whole Earth experiences ice ages at the same time, which otherwise would be a bit of a mystery, because if you look at these changes in the Earth orbit, when the northern hemisphere gets more sunlight, the southern hemisphere gets less, and so you would expect that the 2 hemispheres go through ice ages just out of sync, but they don't, because there's this synchronizing effect of the global CO2 concentration, which acts there as a powerful feedback.
I've got a question regarding the solar activity, because it seems that the sun is has an activity of 11 years with the sunspot numbers, but it seems that there are also very long cycles, and in the Middle Age it seems that there was what they call a Maunder minimum, where the sun activity was very, very low, and it may have an influence on climate. Do you know more about this?
Yeah, sure. The solar activity, first of all, the biggest change that we see is an 11-year cycle, the Schwabe cycle, and that, as you probably know, has no big effect on the global temperature because, or have you ever heard that there's every 11 years we have particularly warm global temperatures? That's not the case. I mean, the effect is minimal of that 11-year cycle. The longer term changes, this Monde minimum was a time when you had practically no sunspots and very relatively weak output of the sun. That was only a few tenths of a degree colder than the times earlier or later. So even that really major change where there were no sunspots caused such a little global temperature change that if the same thing were to happen now, there was some speculation whether we might enter a new Monde minimum because it took a while for the first sunspots to appear in the last year. That would not slow down global warming in a substantial way. It would be much smaller effect than the effect of rising greenhouse gases that we have now. And you can see, I mean, the last 20 years solar activity has been declining, but it hasn't slowed down global warming. It just continues practically unchanged. Maybe without that you'd have a little bit more global warming, but it's compared to the anthropogenic greenhouse gases, it's a small effect.
In the end of your talk, in the what can be done, what has to be done section, you mentioned restructuring, rebuilding power supply, and how it could be done even for less money than the financial crisis has already cost, or will cost, as I understood. But you didn't mention traffic systems, which also are big CO2 emittent, and I think it also could be and should be restructured and modified in a big deal. And well, as far as I understood, governments just as a reaction to this financial and economic crisis do not have much other ideas than rescuing car industry and building more streets and highways for cars, which doesn't seem an appropriate answer.
Yeah, I can only fully agree with you. I'm a great fan of zero-emission vehicles, namely bicycles. But in addition to that, the combustion engine only has an efficiency of about 20%. So 20% of the energy that you have in the petrol actually gives you, goes onto the wheel. If you switch to electric cars, you can get an efficiency of 70 or 80%. And that starts to make sense at the moment where you have this energy system based on renewable electricity from wind power, say, then it becomes very efficient to run electric cars, and you can reduce the emissions by a factor of 2 or 3 by making this system change. So that's another, of course, we have to, in every sector we have to make changes to get the emissions down. There's not one silver bullet or two, there are many changes right through the way how we run our economy and how we live, etc.
Like trains, tramways.
Trams, yeah, public transport. In Berlin you can see a functioning public transport system where many people don't have a car. I think car ownership is like 50% or so on the number of households in Berlin. And my household, for example, we have 2 small kids. We don't have a car because it's easy to get around small scale with bike and ride through Berlin with the S-Bahn and trams, etc.
Hello?
Yeah.
So I'm from the Netherlands, so I'm naturally a bit concerned about global warming. But I do think it's important to realize that the fossil fuels have gave us so much technological advancement, and they even gave us technologies like solar power. So it is our responsibility indeed, but don't you think it's better if you make a strategic decision to end this? I mean, to solve this problem, wouldn't it be better to do that, let's say, 50 years from now, once we've sucked out all the oil and once we have better technology?
Well, it's too late to limit global warming to 2 degrees if we continue on for another 50 years. Actually, even if we continue on and do nothing for another 20 years, it will be too late to still limit global warming to 2 degrees. So we have to turn the tide